Well, Roger, it sounds like you've had quite a nice life yourself. I grew up in a very small town, very small, in the backwoods of Alabama. My phone number was 5. That's not a typo. My phone number was one digit, 5. So I guess most people who grew up in places like that never leave, or they wind up like me and they want to see the world. So for a long time, I wanted to see the world, and I've had motorcycles for a long time, and I knew that that's the best way to do anything. You're much closer to it. It's a lot more fun. It's exhilarating to ride a motorcycle. So for a long time, I was a little nuts, and I wanted to go around the world on a motorcycle. By the time I was 37, I had made more money than I knew existed in the world. And not very much now by today's standards, but in those days, it was a lot of money. And so I retired to set off to have adventure in my life. I know that if I'd stayed working, I'd have a lot more money, but Roger, I'd have a lot more experiences and to me, a more wonderful life by having adventure and seeing the world. I've been around the world twice. I've moved to Asia. I've done various and sundry different things because I wanted to have a different life.
When you actually were traveling around the world, and I know you were one of the very first at a time when people weren't necessarily believing that China was going to have the growth it was going to have, where you were already like seeing that was going to be taking place. And there was a lot of other observations you made, many of them which all came true as well. What would you say were the big surprises as well as you went around in terms of what you were learning about different places? And to what extent would you, just off your experience of that, encourage others to be out there traveling to really get a better perspective as well?
Well, if people weren't around in the 70s and 80s, they've probably forgotten about things like Red China and the Soviet Union, et cetera. It was very difficult to travel around the world in those days. So I went to China in 1984 to say, hello, I'd like to drive my motorcycle across your country because I want to go around the world. Looking back on it, I was totally nuts. I mean, Mao Zedong had only been dead for a few years at that time. They were still, quote, red communist, etc. Anyway, I went and said, can I do it? They said, the first word in Mandarin I learned was mayo, because no matter what I said, are there roads? Mayo. Are there hotels? Mayo. Is there gasoline? Mayo. What's wrong with you? They didn't have anything. And they were right. I didn't know that. But when I got off the plane, I was really scared because all my life, American propaganda had said that Chinese are horrible, terrible, bloodthirsty, vicious people, and you should be afraid of them. I figured I'd get shot when I got to Beijing. As I went around China in the 80s, I realized, oh my gosh, these people are hardworking, very hardworking, ambitious, educated. They discipline their children. They save their money. And I realized that China was on the rise. I also realized that China had been a great nation 3 or 4 times in its history. Rome was great once. Egypt was great once. Great Britain was great once. But China had been great 3 or 4 times in its history. It had had catastrophe and collapsed 3 or 4 times in its history. But every time, after a few decades or a few centuries, somehow or another, they rose to the top again. And I could see that it was happening right before my eyes. I mean, everywhere I went, people were working from dawn to dusk and saving lots of money. So I could see there were changes taking place. Again, it's part of the experiences. If you see the world from the ground up, you get a lot different view than if you just read the newspaper or watch TV through some journalist's eyes. I mean, if you're close to the ground, you find out what's really happening. You cross a border in the jungle, you really find out what's happening. So, but I wanted adventure. I wanted to see the world. I knew that a motorcycle was the best way, at least the best way for me. So I did it. I shouldn't be alive. Roger, I should be dead. But fortunately, I'm not dead.
Very fortunately.
I'm glad I made it alive. I still have my arms and legs. So I'm very pleased.
That's very good. Yeah. Well, actually, this is about the long term. And by the way, for those of you who want to see what those books are, this is Investment Biker, and then this one here is a venture capitalist. And I wanted to share this. I mean, obviously you've had many books out there, and this one is obviously like with commodities. This one here I highly recommend, because it never really even occurred to me when I started my investing in my investing journey that commodities was an investable thing. But obviously you were one of the earliest to really be a proponent of commodities. And I just want to share this with everyone so everyone can see this one. This is now effectively with elements like an ETF. This is like the original Rogers International Commodities Index, where you put this together. And over time, we're just seeing, like, this is actually over 1 year. If someone had looked at this a year ago when it was basically down at 584, it's like, it's pretty much doubled from where it's at. And even the last 3 months, you've seen this growth. And of course, what you're saying now about what people should be looking at in terms of what's happening with commodities, you were saying this all the way back, many decades ago as well. I'd love for you to just share where to what extent was that insight because of the traveling you're doing, or was that something already that you had been looking at the economics of what was happening in the world?
Well, ever since I've been investing, I always invested in everything: stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, long and short. We used to sell short a lot, all over the world. So for me, none of this was new. It's what I always knew. But along I came in the 90s, I was on TV a lot talking about a bull market in commodities would be starting again. And we've had bull markets every 10 or 15, 20 years in commodities. Nothing unusual about it. And my publisher said, gosh, you're always talking about commodities, but aren't any commodity books? So I sat down and said, okay, we'll do a book about how commodities work, what they are, and how you can invest in them. It wasn't a hot tip book. It was a book explaining the commodities markets. That's how the book came about. But the investments came about because in the late 90s, I was about to go around the world again. I wanted to invest in commodities, but there were no ETFs. There were no commodity indexes worth investing in as far as I was concerned. So I had to come up with my own index, because it was my money that I was going to be investing. It wasn't somebody else. It was real money. So I came up with an index and the ETF, and that's how it all happened. But most of my life, Roger's been one accident after another.
Being very modest there. with the shift to Singapore, for me it was 1997. And I was in London, and as you know, England has many skeptics. And I was like, I'm gonna go out to Singapore. And they were, why would you go to Singapore? It's like, well, Asia's the new growing place, and from Singapore, within 5-6 hours, you can get to half the world's population, right? And it's English speaking, so perfect for someone from England. And so I went out there in, I think it was July, and then August was the entire Asia crash. So that wasn't very good timing. But I stuck it out, and that kind of led to my first business there, and then led to my family growing up there, and one thing led to another. And of course, the whole of Asia has grown massively, Southeast Asia as well as China. I'd love to hear, the story of how you prepared, your family. Your daughters all speak fluent Chinese, but at the same time, you chose Singapore rather than China as your base. And I'd love to just hear your and by the way, our company Genius Group is also based in Singapore, so that's its headquarters. Would love to hear your rationale behind that. And obviously, you still travel a lot, but you still believe that Singapore is the right place to have as a base?
Well, for 25 or 30 years, I was always on TV saying, teach your children Mandarin, because I could see what was happening in China. Now, of course, everybody said, no, Japan, right. Japanese. I said, no. China is the new country that's on the rise. So then I had a daughter. By the way, Roger, I never wanted children. I thought children were a horrible waste of time and money. I felt so sorry for my friends who'd ruined their lives by having children. I was never going to do something. I was wrong. It's a long story short, but I was totally wrong about children. And so when I had one, I said, oh gosh, now I got to teach her Chinese, because I've been telling people for 30 years. So we got her this Chinese governess, and she spoke great Mandarin, but people kept telling me, by the time she's 9 or 10 years old, she's not going to do it anymore. You're going to speak to her in Mandarin, she'll speak back to you in English, because it's not cool. So I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I got to take her to a country where she has to speak Mandarin. We looked at China. We went to several Chinese cities, but they were all so polluted. They were filthy. The air was filthy, the water, everything. And I didn't want to breathe the stuff. I didn't want her to breathe the stuff. Singapore looked great. I don't speak Chinese, so in Singapore they speak English and they speak Chinese, so it seemed great. So off we went to Singapore, since China was so polluted. And as you know, everything works in Singapore. It's a great place to live, certainly an easy place to live. New York is very exciting, but it's a hard place to live. Singapore, everything works. Very different from New York. So that's how we wound up in Singapore. I wanted my children to speak Chinese. I wanted them to know Asia, because Asia is going to be the 21st century. So there I am.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually quite amazing because over the last 2 decades, obviously Singapore itself has evolved a lot as well. And especially with what it's now doing to try and nurture more tech companies and to be able to be a good safe harbor for funds coming in from other parts of the world, given all the havoc that's out there at the moment as well. And on that point, there's like the difference of, let's say, Singapore and China. I have a few articles here I wanted to share with everyone, and I found this very interesting because with you invested in Tiger Brokers, and from what I understand, it was one of your first Chinese tech investments, and then of course Tiger Brokers evolved, it grew, it had its IPO, and now it's it's been up at the $1 billion level, and it and it really is like the Robin Hood of Asia, and in fact, global as well. And as you know, we have this partnership with Tiger for both this summit, as well as what we're doing with our own IPO, where they're now giving out the stocks that come with. So they're very innovative with the way they're doing things, and the way they've been mirroring quite a lot that's been happening with the US apps that are out there as well. But of course, for you to go down that line meant that you were feeling pretty bullish about the entire, not just Asian trading, but also the Chinese trading as well. And as we've seen, there's been a lot of changes that the Chinese government has been making to what is or isn't allowed with their own stock markets, or even public companies as well. And it's not just, I'm not just talking specifically about China, but even what's happened recently with Russia, saying, okay, Russian, companies can no longer be listed as well. What's your overall view as to how, what was it originally that got you bullish about China? And are you still feeling the same way about it, or have you modified your views based on what's going on in the world at the moment?
Well, when I went to China, I drove around China several times on my motorcycle in the 80s. I could see what was happening. I finally found a stock market. There was no stock market, but they opened a stock market 1988 or so. On one of my trips, I went down, knocked on the door, and said, "Here I am. I want to buy shares," because since I've been investing in stocks for a few decades, found the stock market, started investing in shares only really seriously in the late 90s. It was impossible before that, because I knew that someday, if you'd invested in America in 1899, you'd have been very, very happy. Well, here it was 1999, and I could see the possibilities of investing in the Chinese stock market. So I did so, and I have been doing so ever since. I was once in China speaking, and I came across Tiger, and I thought it was pretty strange what these guys were going to try to do from a Chinese base. But I could see that they were very smart guys. They had a lot of drive, and they had vision. And if they could do it, it had to be successful, and it had to be a great thing to do. So there I was, and the same thing. I figure 50 years from now, my children will be very, very happy that I invested in China and that I invested in Tiger. You can ask me in another 40 years or so.
Yeah, very, 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 very interesting. I mean, like, again, I think a lot of people, whether they're in Europe or in the US, can't really appreciate the scale of China, just in terms of the population and the economy and the potential of where it's going as well. To what extent, with what we're seeing now in the world and the challenges going, I remember reading something you wrote once, which was that pretty much every country in the world has changed its borders in the last 200 years. So everything's always in constant flux and change. There's obviously many out there that believe that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. What's your personal view as to what we should be expecting or at least preparing for with what's happening geopolitically around the world at the moment, specifically with what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, and the kind of escalations that are taking place right now?
Well, the Russian-Ukraine war is a little bit absurd. It really started because America engineered a coup in Ukraine in 2014, threw out the government and put in a government that was friendly to the U.S. and to NATO, and that has led to the current situation. I mean, I'm not suggesting the Russians are doing anything right. Nobody's doing anything right in Ukraine, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians, but somebody should have and could have figured out a way to solve this problem, it seems to me. Unfortunately, now the gates of war have been unleashed, and it's not easy to close that gate once you open it. And I'm afraid that this is going to continue to have repercussions in Europe, certainly in America, certainly in Russia. It's interesting, Roger, that not many countries outside of Europe are supporting the sanctions, et cetera. So much of the world either is saying we don't care about it, or it's not clear cut who's right or wrong. In the U.S., of course, it's clear cut. The Russians are horrible people. The rest of the world often doesn't see things the way Washington, D.C. does, fortunately or unfortunately. And I'm afraid this is another period like that when many people are questioning who's right and who's wrong here. As far as I'm concerned, they're both wrong. This is an insane war. It's going to ruin a lot of things. And of course, it's accelerating the inflationary movement, which is already underway in the world. And the way to protect yourself from inflation, the best way is in inflation, the prices go up. If you own the things that go up, you're going to get rich. You're certainly going to protect yourself. And so that's one of the reasons I started this commodity index decades ago. And I have a lot of investments in commodities now, because I can see that the commodity bull market may have a long way to go.
Yes.
And partly because of Russia and Ukraine, because of the madness that's happening there. They're both huge producers of agriculture, hydrocarbons. I mean, they produce a lot of stuff that the world uses.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm flying this weekend. I'm flying back from US to London and then on to Warsaw in Poland, where I have been for the last 2 years with my girlfriend, waiting out the pandemic. And when you see, I mean, like it just happened this week, Russia cutting off all the gas to Poland, and immediately the difference in the actual fuel prices that are taking place right now as well. To what extent right now, given that there is all of this man-made turmoil that's taking place, so it's not even like slow moves, changes, they're happening immediately. To what extent is your approach to be looking at what you need to be doing to move into more those commodities that actually are like ending up having shocks put on them? To what extent are you letting things ride out based on the fact that it's quite difficult to ever know exactly what the next move is people are going to be making?
Quite difficult? You mean it's not easy? Investing is not easy? I didn't know that.
Well, maybe easy for you.
I'm glad you warned me. Commodities were in an upcycle anyway because of supply demand for a variety of reasons. Then along came gigantic amounts of money printing like the world has never seen, and borrowing and spending like the world has never seen. So we have to have a commodity bull market, it seems to me anyway. So I own the commodities and I plan to buy more. They're not going to stop printing money. When we start having corrections in the markets, the central banks are going to panic and print even more money. And we may have one last blow off in the stock market. And I do own some shares. I haven't started selling short yet. But after that blow off, I'm afraid we're going to have a horrible bear market, Roger. We've had bear markets throughout history. We've always had them. We'll have them again. And this bull market in America has been going on the longest in American history. It's 13 years now. Doesn't mean it can't go on 30 years, but it already is the longest. Stocks are getting high, inflation's coming back, interest rates are coming. So we're going to have a bear market again. And Roger, it's going to be the worst in my lifetime. 2009, 8, and 9, we had a bear market because of too much debt. Roger, since then, the debt has skyrocketed everywhere in the world, gigantic amounts. So the next bear market has to be a bad bear market. We've had them throughout history. They're going to continue, whether we like it or not, and the next one's going to be very bad.
Would you say that what was taking place after the global financial crisis, which was largely papered over through all the money printing that took place since then, that with the next bear market coming and the fact that the governments are running out of ammunition as to what they can throw at this, we're going to see casualties not just at the kind of individual level or the corporate level, but even at the government level? What do you see happening going forward from your view in terms of where the biggest casualties would be?
Roger, you say running out of ammunition. They're running out of trees. They're printing so much money, you know. I have any trees, so they printed so much money. And you're right. I mean, what they can print and print and print, and they will. But eventually, the markets say, wait a minute, we've seen this game before. We know how this ends. And the market's going to take it away from them. We're going to have a bear market because prices will get too high, and you just cannot keep this going forever. You know, lots of smart people in the market, certainly smarter than the government. And once the market takes away from the central banks, interest rates are going to go very, very high because inflation is going to be high. And that means we're going to have serious bear markets, and we'll have them everywhere. You know, in 2008 and 9, China had a lot of money saved up for a rainy day. Well, it started raining. They started spending their money and helped save the world. Even China has a lot of debt now. So I don't know who's going to save us, Roger. North Korea. North Korea doesn't have any debt, but they don't have any money either. So I don't know who's going to save us next time around. So it's going to be a bad bear market. But again, I hasten to say we've been having bear markets for hundreds of years.
Yes.
The people who figure it out and know and understand what's going on can come out successfully. There were people in the 30s who made a lot of money and came out of all that quite happy. So it can happen. Just be prepared, be knowledgeable of what you're doing.
Well, your company, the Quantum Fund that you co-founded, I felt it was following me around when I was in England in I think it was 1992, and the Quantum Fund shorted the pound and then and did very well out of it. But then, of course, we were all left picking up the pieces, and I was like, I'm going to go to Asia now. And then the Asian crisis, they were also involved in as well. And I'm like, okay, where next? We're seeing, I mean, like the governments don't need any help now to actually create these crises themselves. And that's why there are, like, you know, a lot in the whole decentralized finance side that believe it could be the banks themselves that could actually start collapsing, or even the federal governments, where it could be the city governments that actually are picking up the pieces if they can't keep on taxing at the level they're taxing. And so there you then could have the potential of Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, maybe, you know, a central bank digital currency that could actually, you know, have something out of it. Obviously, the likes of Ray Dalio, who talks about, you know, like what's happening with China and the shift of the US dollar as a reserve currency at some point. Number one, two questions in that. Number one, do you see that the actual like rise of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, etc., could be something that people could look at as a store of value and as a hedge against they're obviously already having a hedge against dollar, but your view on that? And secondly, do you think it could be a government like China that, you know, figures out a way to kind of move into a different, you know, structure of money itself?
Well, to jump into something related, this war, talking about Ukraine and Russia, one of the things it's doing, unfortunately, for us as an American, it's many countries are looking for something to compete with the US dollar as a world's reserve currency for many reasons. One, the US is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. Nobody has ever had this much debt. And the world's reserve currency is supposed to be neutral. You're supposed to be using it for anything you want. Anybody can. But now, unfortunately, Washington has started playing different. If they get mad at you, they cut you off. They put on sanctions. And so many people, even America's friends, are starting to say, wait a minute, that's not the way it's supposed to work. So they are looking for something to compete with, if not replace the US dollar. No world's medium of exchange has lasted more than 100 years, 150 years or so. The US dollar has been around a long time, so we're coming to the end of the line, whether we like it or not. But now Russia, China, India, Brazil, Iran, lots of people are trying to figure out what can compete with and therefore eventually replace the US dollar. And that is a bad consequence. I'm an American, so I don't like saying it, because I can see the writing on the wall. And since the Russian Ukraine situation arose, and they've accelerated it because the US just said, you cannot use, the Russians own a lot of US dollars, which they earned on their own. America's taking them away. Well, that's not, I certainly cannot justify that. And I am an American, as I say. And many other people are taking the same view. We have to find a replacement, or at least a competitor to the US dollar. Now, your question specifically about cryptocurrencies, and many people are working with crypto. I don't know if the numbers are accurate or not, but the numbers are pretty staggering. I certainly know people who've been trading cryptocurrencies quite successfully. I have never bought nor sold crypto. My wife is involved to some extent. But my view, Roger, is that, the Chinese are ahead of the rest of us. In China, you cannot buy an ice cream unless your money is on the computer. You cannot use cash. You cannot use Chinese money to take a taxi in China because they're so far ahead. But everybody's working on it. We will all have it eventually. All money will be on the computer. The US is working on it. And someday when the US says, okay, this is money now, I don't think, Roger, that the US government is then going to say, okay, this is money, but you can use that money over there if you want to. I wish we could use anything we want, but that's not the way most governments and monopolies and bureaucrats think. They want to keep their monopoly in their control. So my view is that if cryptos become successful as currency, governments will do something to tax them or regulate them or outlaw them, who knows what. They've done it many times in history. So I have not been an investor in crypto. I wish I'd bought Bitcoin at $2. I wish I'd bought a lot of Bitcoin at $3, $4. I didn't, I never have. And my view is that if it's successful as currency, the governments will take action. It would be wonderful if they did let us use whatever we want. But at one point, when in England, you could even, banks could print their own money illegally back in those days. But one day in the 30s, the Bank of England said, okay, from now on, it is an act of treason if you don't use our money. Yes. Well, Roger, treason means they execute you. So most people, needless to say, started following the government rules. I'm afraid that will happen again.